You want to.
Good morning. It is Friday, February 4th, in the middle of a beautiful snowstorm, and we are the House Prevention of Discrimination panel here this morning with our friends and guests to speak about accessibility issues, both physical, virtual, all of the accessibilities involved with legislating and ensuring that the public has access to the process and to legislators. So I'm so grateful that we have with us Susan Aronoff, Rachel Selig, and Sarah Wanderville, and they're going to give us their perspectives and help us take yet another look at this issue. Susan, would you like to start?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to come and spend time with you this morning. We greatly appreciate it, and we're really, really excited to work with you to try to make the State House a better place for all, and really, really appreciate your taking the time to learn about this. So I'm just really going to tee things up for my two colleagues who are have much more expertise, but I'll just share with you what my experience has been in my role. So I work for what's called the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council, and we're made up of a majority our public members, are a majority of people with disabilities themselves and their family members. And people with disabilities in the intellectual developmental disability world are often called themselves self-advocates. And it's to make the distinction between having other people advocate on their behalf or the people who speak for themselves. And so in the disability world, we have self-advocates and we have advocates who are often people like me, paid employees. I do have a history of disability myself, but I'm a staff person. But my main job is to try to get access to people with disabilities and their family members to the State House. And the main day that people have access is on this day that's called Disability Awareness Day, when like 300 or 400 people with disabilities descend on the State House. And it is a cluster. And I won't describe life on Disability Awareness Day, because what I tried to do and for the last, until the pandemic shut us down, was doing, pretty regularly for 2 or 3 years, was this project I called Make a Date, where I invited my council members and people who were doing leadership training with us, which we did a leadership training annually with Vermont Family Network and with the Green Mountain Self-Advocates, so family members and self-advocates, to invite people to the State House any other day but Disability Awareness Day, so that they could have a chance in a less sensory overloaded environment to talk one-on-one, to meet their legislator, to understand the process, to maybe be introduced on the floor, to sit in a committee, to learn how a bill becomes a law. And I would tell them, it didn't have to be disability. If they were into hunting and trapping, fish and wild, whatever their jam was, I was there. Make a date, let's go, show up. And I will tell you, from an intellectual developmental disability point of view, the State House could use some improvements. First and foremost, and this isn't like a legal requirement I'm talking about, just what would make it easier for people. I will leave it to Rachel Selig, who's the director of the Disability Law Project, and Sarah Wanderville, who's the executive director of the Center for Independent Living, to talk about legal requirements. But I'll just talk about my experience day to day, bringing people in and out, what would make it easier. And you could kind of start with the website, because we put out a weekly newsletter with hot links where we try, especially in this virtual age, to let people know what's going on at the State House. And I will tell you right now, the thing that's hardest to find on the website are the streaming links and the explanation. There's like an announcement on the top of the legislature's homepage about the State House being shut down. but there aren't really clear instructions for people, especially people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, to understand how they can now so easily watch in real time or on YouTube bills becoming laws, people testifying. The streaming links are really hard to find. And then if there was just some like plain language explanations for things, there's so many big words and phrases. Like, we're launching this thing right now. We're all learning. We are all learning. Right now, because I can't make a date and bring people to the State House, we're launching something, you'll soon be getting yours, called Postcards from Home. And we're doing videograms with people who want to get messages into the inboxes of their legislators. And I started calling it Postcards from Home Constituent Testimonials. And I was proud of myself. I love that, constituent testimonials. And then I was like, oh my God, plain language. So now it's Postcards from Home, Voices from Vermont Voters, or Voices of the Voters, or something like that. So just bringing things to fewer syllables, plainer language. The website, anywhere you can get plain language in. But then my process that I find for bringing people in and out of the building, people with physical challenges, people with sensory challenges, people with hearing challenges, people who communicate differently and might need facilitated communication with them. Every single one of those. Oh, people with sensory challenges. Oh my God. I have a dear friend, one of my closest friends in my life since 19, and you guys know him, Samuel Lurie. Coming to the State House for someone with a sensory, and he's public about this. Oh. Anyone with a sensory disability coming into the State House can be thrown into a migraine or a seizure or anything by someone with a strong cologne or aftershave or perfume. And you sit in some of those committee rooms, and whether it's a member of the legislature or a member of the public, there is zero consciousness or awareness of fragrances and sensory issues, as that issue alone. Huge for access, because I bring people into the building who can have seizures, you know, for varieties of reasons, and all the things that trigger seizures. The State House environment is just rife with noises and blinking lights. And you need those blinking lights, red for, you know, the Senate and green for the House, but they're everywhere. And you don't realize it unless you're a person for whom your skin is just like earlobes everywhere, and you take everything in very differently. Going through the cafeteria line to get food for someone who doesn't want to be touched, good luck with that. Again, the senses, and so there's no options, there's no alternatives. Once, 25 years ago, I needed to use a wheelchair for a couple of years. A couple of months, and it was right in the middle of the legislative session. I went from a lobbyist walking around to a lobbyist using a wheelchair. And the sergeant at arms took kind of pity on me and assigned a page to me. So when I needed lunch, it was before the new cafeteria, I had a page go get me lunch, because there was no way I was getting through the cafeteria and getting lunch with a tray and a wheelchair. It just wasn't happening. And it is no better today in the new cafeteria 25 years later. I used to follow Ed Pakeman around. I was amazed. How the hell does he do this? He shouldn't have to be that hard to get assistance, accommodations, basic things when you go to the people's house. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Rachel, who can tell you more about the laws. And then I did want to say, because I listened to the tape of your proceedings, that you guys as legislators and your employees, the staff, like what happens if you want to hire a staff assistant or a ledge counsel who uses a wheelchair or who's visually impaired? I'm not sure people would know what to do, but I want to say that issues for employees and for legislators are different than issues for the general public. And I got from Mari, from your introduction, you're really interested in us talking about the experience of the public. So that's where I went.
Thank you, Susan. I think definitely the public, but it should be for all, and I appreciate you bringing that up. Representative Kalaki.
Thank you, Representative Cordes. And Susan, I wonder if you would share the exchange we had on Disability Awareness Day when we were last in person at the House, because that's a conversation that jump-started this whole idea for me, and I shared with my committee members. But do you remember that? Okay.
It's crystal clear, crystal clear. So I will tell you, so I'm dating myself here. I've been attending Disability Awareness Days at the State House since the late 90s. But then I had a 14-year break and went off to Connecticut. But I'm back now. And Disability Awareness Day 2020 was supposed to have been March 12th, the day before everything shut down. But at the beginning of that week, we pulled the plug on it. And at that time, it seemed like out of an abundance of caution. And then in retrospect, it was like, what were we thinking? But, you know, that's what that week was like. So it was the year before. So it would have been sometime in March, probably, I forget the date of Disability Awareness Day that year, of 2019. And typically what happens on Disability Awareness Day is that there's a period after lunch when the House comes back into session, when all the people attending Disability Awareness Day and the businesses being honored by the Governor's Council on Employment for People with Disabilities and other groups get recognized on the House floor. And, you know, you guys who spend a lot of time there, it's like no big deal. But for people who come up from Brattleboro or Bennington or have never been there before, to like be on the House floor, to hear their name or to see their rep or someone they know, it can be a big deal. And to see that many people filling the House, people with disabilities, it's a real big deal. And up until John Kalaki being a member of the House and being on the House floor, it was general practice that the Sergeant at Arms would not allow people in chairs into the well of the House. Maybe some in the back, but you know, the aisle, but never could you block the door. And rarely, if ever, did anyone come in with a chair or anything on the side entrance. And so there was a Disability Awareness Day, and there was John Kalaki, and John was like, where are the people in the chairs? And I was like, they're out in the hall. And there was this wonderful Sergeant at Arms, I think her name is Ro, I'm blanking on her name. Anyway, she was at the door, and John disappeared and then came back. And the next thing I knew, Ro opened the door and the people in the chairs came, and they were like in the well of the House. And it was the first time that there were people in wheelchairs in the well of the House. And it shouldn't be that big of a deal, but it was a pretty big deal. Is that the moment?
Well, the moment for me is that people in chairs were told they had to be outside and listen instead of participate. And that was so shocking to my core, that on Disability Awareness Day, that, you know, I went to the speaker, and it was mostly just, you know, unawareness or ignorance. And so it was a great learning moment for us in the House, but it, you know, it's bracing. And that's, you know, why the committee, when I mentioned this, thought this would be a really good topic for us to really understand. So thank you, Susan.
Yeah, thank you. That was really huge. And you know what, John, it makes the difference. People always say, oh, you make the change from the inside out, but it's really different having someone with lived experience being in the State House. And when you were part of the panel on Disability Awareness Day with Anthony, and you know, and you talked about legislating with a disability, that was like really powerful. But it was really super powerful having you on the floor that day to say, this is not okay. And I hate to say it, but I think sometimes it takes having someone with lived experience on the floor to say, this is not okay. So thank you for being there to say, this is not okay.
I think there are many that would agree with you that it, I would say, usually takes people with lived experience to initiate change. And the more I listen, the more we think about this. I think there's so much more work to do and listening to do that I think we need a disability caucus or a group that's focused specifically on these issues, because it's huge. We'll continue to do the work in the House Discrimination Prevention Panel, but I think this deserves its own working group. All right, with that, Rachel, would you like to continue?
Sure, thank you. For the record, my name is Rachel Selig. I am the director of the Disability Law Project at Vermont Legal Aid. I'm also a person with a disability. For those who might not be as familiar with the Disability Law Project, we are a special project at Vermont Legal Aid, and we are part of the protection and advocacy system in the state of Vermont. The designated P&A is Disability Rights Vermont, and we work with them to provide legal services to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, people with traumatic brain injury. We also provide legal advice to people under what we call our PAIR grant, which is for folks with mobility and disabilities that aren't intellectual developmental disability or mental illness. And we have grants as well to provide legal assistance for folks who need assistive technology. And we are the CAP, which is the Client Assistance Program. So we help people with disabilities who need help with their interactions with voc rehab, or even sometimes with VCIL, although not too often these days, which is good. So what I thought I would do is just talk a little bit, just to kind of provide some background on what the ADA requires and how it is connected to this conversation. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is a federal law that was passed in 1990 and became effective in 91. And it has 3 titles to it. So we have Title I, which is about employer-employee relationships. So that's when Susan was talking about the folks who work, for example, for Ledge Council, or you all as legislators, or other folks who are employed by the legislature. Any disability issues and any requests for reasonable accommodations for employees, those sorts of things would fall under Title I. Then we have Title II, which is what I'm going to focus on today, because that's the title that covers public entities, which includes state governments and legislatures. And then we have Title III, which is what covers places of public accommodation. So businesses and hotels and restaurants and our ski areas and all of those different kinds of public places are covered by Title III. But I'm going to focus in on Title II, because if what we want to focus on today is access to the State House, both physically and virtually, really what we're going to focus on is Title II. So Title II has what I think of as a few kind of major requirements and in the law, and then we also have pretty extensive regulations to implement these. So first of all, the ADA in Title II is a non-discrimination law, right? So it is prohibited to discriminate against people on the basis of their disability. And I'm happy to talk about the definition of disability or kind of some of the examples in the law and the regulations about what counts as discrimination, if you have questions about that. But that's kind of the first and overall arching thing, is that we can't discriminate on the basis of disability. Second, Title II does require that we provide reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities in order to have access to public entities. And again, happy to provide some examples of that. Title II is also where we find what we call the integration mandate, the requirement that we include people with disabilities to the same extent as possible with people without disabilities. So not separating folks out and having them have to sit in a separate room, or having them, those kinds of things. Title II also requires that we ensure physical accessibility, and there is a whole separate set of ADA guidelines for what needs to happen in order for a building to be physically accessible. And then there are a whole bunch of exceptions to that for historically significant buildings that have been, I think, part of what some of the challenge has been with the physical accessibility of the State House. And having grown up going to the State House since I probably was an infant, I love the State House. And the older I've gotten, the more I've realized how many different kinds of people with different disabilities, it is a difficult building to be in. And I know there's been some talk of being able to add some space to the State House, and the rules that would apply to a new space are different than the rules that apply to a pre-existing space. And so it would be very important for any expansion to be in compliance with those rules, and buildings and services really should be as familiar as possible with those. And we've seen that in projects the state has built since those have gone into effect. The ADA also requires that we allow service animals into public entities, and service animals has a pretty specific and actually fairly narrow definition relative to the broader category of emotional support animals. And that applies just to housing. But service animals need to be specifically trained. They don't need to have any certification. You don't have to have a special harness, but service animals do need to be allowed into the building. And then for Vermonters who are deaf or who are hard of hearing, or Vermonters who have a vision impairment, the effective communication requirement, I think, is key, and is especially key when we're meeting on Zoom. And I have every meeting, we've got the auto captions going. I run the auto captions because it helps me focus when I'm meeting and when I'm listening to lots of different people talk. But effective communication is it's actually one of the things where the person doesn't necessarily have to come and ask you for a reasonable accommodation. It's an affirmative obligation to make sure that public entities are ensuring as effective communication for people with disabilities as for those without. And so this often applies to deaf Vermonters who need an ASL interpreter or live CART interpretation, computer interpretation, in order to communicate. And I think one of the things that's important to remember is not everyone who speaks American Sign Language or ASL also speaks English. And so captioning may or may not be super useful. So those, I've kind of hit the highlights of some of the requirements of the ADA. And I thought I'd pause here and see if there were questions about how these might kind of apply both in the physical building and in the Zoom world. And Sarah, you're also very welcome to jump in if you feel like I skipped over something that the independent living groups feel is most important. So.
Thank you, Rachel. John, I do see you. I have a quick question about the transcription, the live transcription. How is it accurate enough to be useful? Because when I look at it, it looks like gibberish.
For me, more often than not, it's useful, but I don't have a hearing impairment. I use it for focus. For people who have a hearing impairment and can't also be watching your lips because the video is not working, it's often not going to be effective. Really the best practice is to have a live captioner in each session who is listening and transcribing and can correct an error live if they start typing something or realize that something has gone in a different direction.
Would it be good practice to have understanding the need for interpretive services, but would it be good practice to have American Sign Language with interpretation as needed and live transcribing happening at the same time?
That would be very good practice. Yes.
And talk about CART a little bit more. And yeah, tell me who uses CART.
Can
How
I
does it
actually,
work?
can I defer to Sarah on that one? Because I don't need CART, and so I haven't personally used it, and I think some of the peers that she works with will be able to give her just a better ability to explain CART than I can.
Sure. And Sarah, would it be okay with you if I took John and Susan's questions and then you can answer all of them? Does that sound good? Okay. John.
Thank you, and thank you, Rachel, for sharing. You gave us the basic requirements, which is really great, and we need to catch up with the 1990 requirements. But I wonder if you could talk about also the online experience, because even our website, like, I think what would be important for us to understand is not the basic requirements, but what are the best practices?
So as the lawyer here, I'm always cautious because I don't want to, I'm not giving you all legal advice. You have lawyers to do that for you. But just kind of as an educational piece, the 508 regulations are the regulations that are really the ones that are applicable to websites. And so there are some basic things that you really have to do that make the website more accessible. And then there are some things that kind of get you to a higher level of certification. And I apologize, it's escaping. W3c is the organization that sets those standards. But there are some best practices within those. So being able to, for example, have a button to enlarge the print for someone with a visual impairment. Having an option for the screen to read to you. A lot of folks with vision impairments do have screen readers, but I've seen some really well done websites by disability organizations where you go to the page and it reads it to you. But certainly at a minimum, I believe W3c requires that the page be readable by a screen reader. And I have not tested the legislature's website to do that. It can be tested to see how it's doing with that. I would imagine, given how much is on each page, that it will struggle with passing a screen reading test. And Sarah or Susan, you may both have some experience from peers and from self-advocates to speak to about that. Susan mentioned earlier that the links for the live stream are hard to find. I do agree with that. And the links are put out as links, as the whole like long string of http:// blah, 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 blah. That's hard for a screen reader to read. So if instead you had a hyperlink that said link to YouTube, that actually might be easier for someone to navigate than the whole layout. In terms of the live sessions, I think we talked about captioning, we talked about ASL interpretation. I think the other big thing that's a good practice that is for folks to provide a visual description, which I did not do when I started, but if you have people with vision impairment, even though it's live and it's on video, they're not seeing what you look like or what your background is clearly. And it's a way for you to describe yourself to the person, and then also for them to then be able to recognize your voice because you've introduced yourself, you've described who you are, and they can have that connection. So those are some of the really good practices that I think help make life on YouTube a little bit and Zoom a little bit more accessible. And I'm sure, Sarah, there are lots more things that you can mention as well when you talk.
And is it WC3 is the name of the organization?
I will get back to, I believe it's W3c, but I will get back to you on that because it's one of those things that doesn't always stay in my head.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And I imagine that there are already existing lists of the issues that an inventory, whether it's in one place or in each of your own jurisdictions. But my desire is to within this panel and any subsequent work groups that might be an offshoot from it, have a running inventory of issues at the State House, organized in a certain way, and to be able to have conversations with human resources, with the Speaker's office, with Representative Emmons, who will be, I hope, meeting with this panel in our next meeting, and all of you, in a continued conversation about how do we strategize moving forward to make things better. So thank you for your patience, Sarah. I see you've been writing things down. So yes, Susan?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I took my hand down, but there's someone who I think we ought to bring into this loop, and I meant to do it before this meeting and I forgot. And that is that Dale, the Department of Disabilities, Aging, Independent Living,
Yeah.
in last budget cycle got funding to hire a coordinator for deaf and hearing impaired affairs. Sarah's got the title better. Anyway, Laura Siegel, I think is definitely someone who could be a resource and should be looped in. And
Thank
maybe
you.
Sarah can shoot everyone her email. I'm not in a good place to do that. But anyway, Laura Siegel, state employee, those questions you're having about CART and access, and that's what she's really good at.
Dale, thank you. Dale was definitely on my list.
Yeah.
All right, Sarah.
Hey everybody. So I'm Sarah Wanderville. My preferred pronouns are she and her, and I'll give you my visual description because we do that typically at meetings. So I'm a white woman with medium brown hair, I wear glasses, and I'm in front of a red screen or curtains right now. I'm the executive director of the Vermont Center for Independent Living and the president of the Vermont Coalition for Disability Rights. And I was trying to write notes to sort of answer some of your questions, but I'm thinking maybe I could start with the presentation I had. I think that some of that stuff is in there. And Mike has said that I can share my screen. I just have notes. It's not very formal. And it was very quick. So, but I'm just going to take you through sort of our thoughts. When we look at access, we typically look through the lens of accessibility or universal or human-centered design. And I think Representative Clackey was getting to that. It's like there's the law, there's the ADA, there's a Public Accommodations Act, there's 504, but then there's human-centered design, like what's the most usable for us in our community. And so I think that this committee should look beyond the law, look at what is really going to be the most effective for your constituents, for us, for people who are working within the State House to be able to really access that whole system. So at VCIL, we tend to look at things, the barriers that we have to the community typically are around attitudinal barriers, communication, and physical access. That's sort of the lens that we look through. And so this is not an exhaustive list. I'm happy to get more into details, but the first part that I think about are the attitudes. Training to staff, there's always somebody new. Like there have been times in my career, since 97, where people who use wheelchairs have been allowed in the well of the house. And then there are times there's not. So like this example that we were using earlier, it's like there's always somebody new who has the power and control of that sort of system. And so making sure whatever we decide to do can be, talked about on it maybe an annual basis and have all the right players, the sergeant at arms, the people who are really the holders of some of that overall, so that we can make sure that it doesn't continue to happen after you've done all this really good work to make sure that it's better. Disability etiquette training might be another really good thing. It's sort of, again, bare minimum, but at least give some people who might be afraid or haven't talked to people with disabilities before some basic knowledge around language, around how to interact with people with disabilities, how to not do harmful things, how to not, touch people's equipment or whatever those things are. And all of that comes from experience that we've had at the State House, that people with disabilities have had at the State House, of people grabbing wheelchairs and trying to move people along. Or, I think of Disability Awareness Day. One of my first Disability Awareness Days, I had just come off of disability benefits. I have a psychiatric disability. And one of the senators, who's a prominent senator still today, walked up to me to my table. I was trying to give information about our organization and said, well, what's your disability? And I was taken aback, and it totally threw me. Like, I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't out about my disability yet. I had been institutionalized. I didn't want to talk about any of that, especially when I was just trying to say, here's something about the home access program, right? So it was like having conversations with people to learn about what that looks like, and then how to help people get that information. There's a new book. Emily Ladow wrote a book called Demystifying Disability. I'm passing it out to anybody who wants it, from VCIL. And it gives some of those really clear pieces of information around disability etiquette. And then the other thing around attitudes is sometimes laws that, and this is probably a little bit beyond what your committee is looking at, but not creating laws that are potentially harmful to people with disabilities. You know, we passed the People First language bill years ago, but sometimes there's unintended consequences in those laws that we're looking at, or that Ledge Council is drafting, because so many people still come from a perspective of disability as something that we need to help, or that you're vulnerable, and don't think of it through the lens of a rights or a justice perspective. And so having some conversations around that with attitudes is important. Shifting to sort of that lens of communication access, having a really good way that people can request reasonable accommodations right on the website, having staff understand what that process looks like. It's been clunky over the years. Like, how can somebody request an American Sign Language interpreter? How can they request, I put in here this open cart versus the Zoom cart options. And you were having a conversation earlier around that. Like, how good is this automatic captioning? And I, like Rachel, use it for focus. And, earlier when we were talking about deaf individuals, and I'll see if it does it now, if you're using your captioning, the word deaf comes up as deaf. And so people getting the right information is not going to happen necessarily if they're hard of hearing. So there is that. And people who use captioning, people who are hard of hearing, people who are using it for focus, that sort of thing, are not necessarily people who are also culturally deaf, people who use American Sign Language. And so that's why I think Rachel was talking about the best practice is if somebody needs an ASL interpreter, it's a whole different thing. And there are ways that you can work with the deaf community around pinning interpreters on the Zoom links. And there's lots of people, and I think Laura Siegel is a great resource. She just put out a resource, and I can share with you around for the Secretary of State's office, and it's on their website around making elections more accessible. So I'm sure that she could maybe connect with you on this as well. And then I think around the website, using plain language, if we really want people to understand what's out there, using plain language, maybe incorporating ASL or American Sign Language videos into it. American Sign Language it's a different language. And so having little videos to help with that. I did reach out to one of the VCL staff to do a access audit quickly, and he said he's going to do it this weekend just to see if screen readers are really accessible with the website, so I can get you that information.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and then the public hearing instructions, like in accommodations, it always gets to me that someone comes all the way to a public hearing. And, we understand that the limitations around 2 minutes or 3 minutes but if you have a speech disability or you're deaf and you're using sign language, it takes you longer to get your point across. And so having a reasonable accommodation and having the person with a disability understand they can ask for that accommodation in those settings, and then having the committees understand that that's reasonable, that someone with a speech disability get 4 minutes so that they can get their point across, that sort of thing. In terms of physical, VCIL does access assessments, and we're happy to come and help do an assessment or of either partial pieces of the State House or the full State House, whatever that you're interested in. We could work with that. We're the technical assistant for the Americans with Disability ADA Technical Center out of Boston. So we do that work. Some initial thoughts that I think of are the parking lot. There's just a few accessible parking spaces. It's not enough overall. The committee rooms are too small. These are things that are not going to shock anybody, right? And it's not just around wheelchairs and people who use technology, but space. Other people's disabilities are affected. If you, like Susan was talking about earlier, have sensory issues or other disabilities, it can be really intimidating to go into a very small room, not have the space that you need, those sorts of things. Chemical sensitivity is an issue that Susan also talked about around, we have what's called a chemical sensitivity statement at our organization that just says that we're a fragrance-free zone, that it can cause people with certain disabilities to have worse experiences. And the State House is definitely full of a lot of chemical smells that people have when they walk in. So the online programming, we've talked about this, needs to have accesses around captioning and ASL interpretation, like hands down all the time. And I think that for the most part, that's finally come online around the Zoom meetings, at least for the auto captions. But again, having people have an option around asking for an accommodation if they need live captioning, that's important, or live ASL interpretation. I was thinking these are just notes, I'm sorry. So how to request a reasonable accommodation. I was thinking that whole section on the website that talks about like the personal hearing devices that can be accessed at the State House. That's the place where I think you could put so much more robust information around accommodations and have like a lot more information, because that's like one accommodation that the State House is currently or had been currently offering. And so that section of the website might work. My phone's ringing. Never here. And then if you look at the map of the State House, it shows where the accessible locations are, and the entrance that's supposed to be the accessible entrance on Saturdays only. We've sometimes found that that's a locked entrance. So making sure that wherever your accessible entrances are, that they're unlocked. And that's, again, a training issue, making sure that people understand that people can access those entrances in the same way. Again, around training, service animals are not pets, and having some information around that so people are treated with respect when they come in with a service animal. That Rachel went through a whole great list around this, that, you're not required to have a vest. A lot of people put vests on their animals because people treat them with such disrespect when their experiences sometimes, but having that information for the people who are at least in charge would be helpful. On your website, there's, still using the word handicap for parking. We've changed long ago to accessible parking and just use the access symbol, really moving away from the word handicap. There's a lot of history to that word. And then I just threw in, I would want to measure in the women's first floor restroom where that little wicker couch is. I used to nurse my baby there, but I think that it's in front of the accessible stall. And my guess is a bigger power chair isn't going to be able to maneuver through, but that's something that all access assessments could sort of help, get to the meat of what you're trying to get to. So
Sarah, I'll bring you into the men's rooms as well with that measuring tape.
I love doing that.
Because we need help with all of the restrooms. Yeah.
I've heard the biggest restroom is I haven't seen it yet, is a men's room in the basement.
There we are.
Is that true, John?
Well, it is true. It's totally, you can't get down there.
Yeah, so it's not.
But once you get in there, it's even worse.
Okay.
So yes, major issues even in that one.
So I had a question that popped up when you were talking about hearings, and thinking about even as a legislator, I still get nervous when I speak in another committee or on the floor. And in public hearings, especially if there's good, very valid reason to be emotional, and it's a heartfelt issue, it would make sense to not have the person that would need accommodations like 4 minutes or something else have to ask during the hearing in front of everybody else. So that's another one of those affirmative issues where we need to find a way to have that access be there, just be there, and not have to have anyone ask for it. Rachel.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had such a strong reaction to that I wanted to jump in. Sarah, Susan, and I know how to reach out to the clerks for each of the committees. We know, how to navigate the process. For many people who are coming to the State House, they have no idea that the committees have somebody to reach out to ask for assistance. And I think even navigating on the website, it's not always super clear. Well, who do I contact if I need a reasonable accommodation? Do I contact the person for this committee? Do I contact the sergeant at arms? Do I contact? And so having kind of a designated place to go to, not necessarily to become the only door, but to have someone who is the guru for reasonable accommodations, like extra time, like doing it in room 11 because this room is much too small for everyone. Those kinds of things, I think that would go a long ways to helping people navigate the physical space.
Thank you. I can say the Speaker's office has asked a number of caucuses to work together and then use this panel to be the liaison to her office and to human resources in the State House. And so this constellation of other groups, Social Equity Caucus, the White Affinity Group, and at least one other group, have been working on a number of projects, including a communication to people who want to be witnesses, who want to testify. And this would be, I think, one perfect place, as long as we did it in an affirmatively accessible way, to make sure that people knew what the accommodations were, and to seek out someone to talk to about that. So I'll make sure that gets added to this witness communication in whatever forms it takes to add that. Susan.
Yeah, I just thought of something else, and Sarah's probably way more up to speed on this than I am. But we do this thing every year called Disability Awareness Day, and it's been tricky to do it in the virtual space. And in real time, it had become, I think, a lot more about an event that really brought the disability community together and powered up the disability community more than necessarily got airtime in committees or raised awareness of issues for legislators. Like, I don't know, Maury, I don't think there's been Disability Awareness Day testimony in the Healthcare Committee on a regular basis. It's hard to get in. So I'm just wondering if this year's Disability Awareness Day, which is in its planning stages and Sarah's more familiar with it, if maybe we add a panel or a session or something that's about access to the process or something. Access to.
Yeah, I think that.
Just thinking out loud here, because it is an opportunity. It's something we try to get legislators interested in, but we don't really usually have panels geared towards issues around legislating, if you know what I mean, the legislative process.
Yeah, and that would be a perfect day to do it. And I can't speak for the Speaker's office and human resources about what's on their plate right now, but I almost called you Dr. Kalaki. Representative Kalaki brought up definitely doing a training, or we could do a panel. So I think that would be one perfect time to do it. And so I can take that message to the Speaker's office about timing. Can you, I will have difficulty remembering unless it's written down. Can you send me some sort of communication about when Disability Awareness Day is? It's fine if you tell me now, but I may not remember, so I'd appreciate an email or something. Is that okay, Susan?
Yeah, I was looking to Sarah because,
Or
sorry,
Sarah.
because
Yeah, that'd
Sarah's
be great. Thanks.
Go ahead, Sarah.
way more up to speed on disability awareness day
Right.
planning. than I am.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, so Disability Awareness Day is sort of planned for what we're working, and the panel is already planned for that day. But my thought is maybe get our ducks aligned around some of this stuff, like getting the website a little bit better, getting the processes for accommodations a little bit better, like figuring out where this committee is going to go and have something, and then maybe have a presentation that we all just agree on a date that we can do. The cool thing about Zoom, right? We can do it anytime.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we got 5 minutes before, no, we actually have a little bit longer. Anyway, we're scheduled till 9:30. And I don't want to make you all go over with your time. Let me know if you need to head out. We actually don't have to be in the House session until 10:30 because of snow. Oh, thank you, Rachel, for those guidelines in the chat. For anyone listening, Rachel pasted the W3c guidelines, and they're found at www.w3.org. W3c Guidelines. So the panel needs to have a couple of minutes just to talk about communications going forward. But before we do that, I want to make sure that we have some sort of plan for next steps for this work. What I'm hearing is working on the audit / inventory, and my intern will be also listening to this video and taking notes. And I might have, her name's Caitlin Shawnoff. And pardon me, I don't usually use the phrase my intern. I have an intern working with me from UVM, Caitlin Shawnoff. And I think might be great if a few of us could work with point people from all of you on next steps and what they might look like. Does anyone from this panel want to be part of a group working on next steps? John, Rep. Dr. Kalaki, Sarah Wanderville, Susan, Rachel, Kelly, you look like you want to say something. Rep. Payala.
Well, yeah, I would be happy to when I can. I just don't want to overcommit myself because I still have my job that keeps, my family fed that I have to be on top of. And so I'll happily join in when I'm able, but I just don't want to
Overcommit. I understand.
overcommit.
Yes, we have these other activities that subsidize our legislative habits.
Right.
Okay, so I'm in the same position, Rep. Payala, but I'm happy to work with. And John, do you have a question, or you want to be on that work group?
Well, I have a question, and it's to Sarah. I really liked your three-part, your notes gave us 3 different areas to look at. And so if you would please email, we know it's your incomplete notes, but it actually, I think, gives the panel a way forward. And like, here are the 3 buckets, and let's look at attitudes, let's, look at communications, and then let's look at the physical issues. It's particularly pertinent because we are in one of our House committees, they are actually looking at what it would be if we did expand the state House. And so that will be very important. Like Rachel, you said, there's very different requirements. So, we're going to have to make sure our buildings folks understand those different requirements for the new part of. So this is very helpful and so timely. So I, want to appreciate that. And I don't have another full-time job. So as many of the other reps. So I am glad to be working alongside our chair here and moving it forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so
Appreciate that
much.
very much, John. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, John.
Yeah.
Doctor.
That's gonna stick, you realize?
Yeah, it's gonna stick. Dr. John.
I've been called so many things. It's okay if that's six, okay?
I so appreciate all of you, Susan, Sarah, Rachel, just for everything. But I also appreciate you taking time with us. And I know it's been a longstanding issue. And I really, really am earnest about wanting to move forward with this. And I very much appreciate Representative Kalaki raising this issue for the panel to make a strategic plan about. Thank you. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. I think our panel, if we could just hang on there, we can stay live. But I just want to talk about communication, how to get some of this information out to the rest of the legislators about what we have accomplished in the last couple meetings. Thank
Thank
you
you
all.
so much for the opportunity. It's good to
Thank
see
you.
all of you.
Stay safe.
Bye.
All right. So with all of us just talking about how hard it is to hold other jobs while legislating, I do want to get a communication out in the form of a newsletter as the speaker requested. So maybe what I can do is start a cloud document and have each of us contribute a concept or more if you have time to add more to the document. And then I can, with whoever else has time to work on it with me and Caitlin, our UVM student, we can maybe plan on getting a communication out to legislators within 2 weeks. Does that seem reasonable? I can't see folks if you're off screen. So maybe raise your hand if you think that makes up. There's a thumb. All right, I will do that. Start a cloud document. I might enlist your help, Mike, with that. And we can just start by throwing concepts down and grow it into an actual communication. Anything else from any of you?
Well, Representative Corse, I am glad to send you notes on today's conversation, if that'll help you of this component. Since I'm new to the panel, I don't know when you say this cloud document, what are the aspects you want to communicate with or in what form, but
the topics that we have talked about in the last couple of meetings. So
Okay.
we want to make sure to cover what we talked about today. And then in other meetings, we've talked about a witness document and the work of the White Affinity Group and Social Equity Caucus. So I can focus on that part and maybe Rep. Small. I can't remember if you're in Social Equity Caucus. I can get help with that. The White Affinity Group can help me with that. And then are you all familiar with working with a cloud type document like Google Drive, Google Sheets, Google Doc? This would be the same thing, but in Microsoft world.
we'll try.
All right, well, I'll help each other, and we've got Mike as well. Mike, do you want to come on screen if you, and you don't have to if you're doing something else, but if you're there, feel free.
Happy to.
Okay. All right, thank you so much, everybody. I'll follow up shortly now while I remember Mike with getting a document started.